Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We are in for a treat. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to remind you that this is the first of two events that the Moynihan Center is organizing in partnership with the Jack Miller Center to commemorate and reflect on the legacy of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, 250 years ago. And for that purpose, we have invited two illustrious scholars to do so, the first of whom is Roosevelt Montás, whom I will introduce in a second, but is writing a book about, closely related to this topic, and as you'll see in a second, is a great lecturer and has told me that what he would like to do is lecture for about 30 minutes. So we have an hour and 15 minutes, and then there will be ample time to have questions and answers. I really encourage you to prepare questions in the spirit of the Moynihan Center and City College, the spirit of intellectual exchange, which is very much the spirit of Roosevelt as well. So throughout the talk, I encourage you to think about questions because there will be ample time to have a real substantive discussion. I now move on to introduce our speaker. Roosevelt Montás is John and Margaret Bard Professor in Liberal Education and Civic Life at Bard College. Prior to joining Bard, he was on faculty at Columbia University as senior lecturer in American Studies and English, and he also served as director of Columbia's Center for the Core Curriculum from 2008 to 2018. Roosevelt was born in the Dominican Republic and immigrated to New York as a teenager, where he attended public schools in Queens, New York. His book, Rescuing Socrates, How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation, published by Princeton University Press in 2021, reflects on his experiences as a student and then a teacher at Columbia University, explaining how a liberal education transformed his life and why great books have the power to speak to peoples of all backgrounds. He's also the author of Becoming America, 4 documents that shaped a nation and why their ideas still matter, which I believe is the basis for his discussion of the Declaration of Independence today. He speaks and writes on the history, place, and future of liberal education, and his essays have appeared in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wall Street Journal, and many other prestigious outlets. So I'm personally thrilled for myself and for you to have this opportunity. Please join me in thanking Roosevelt for being here.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you. I'll start. Yeah. Thanks for that warm welcome, Carlo. I'm really thrilled to be here. I was once here before, not in this room, but as a guest to speak to Carlo's class in political theory, political science, and just I've lived in Washington Heights most of my life now. Just up the street from here, and studied and worked at Columbia all of my career until recently when I moved up to Bard College, which is about 100 miles just north of here. So City College has always felt like a home in a way. And it's always been my a fantasy to work here and have Carlos' job, so I'm working on it. I'm going to just grab this microphone and Carlo, I apologize because I think sometimes I'm going to give you my back if I'm going to be facing the student. Yeah. So I want to talk to you today about the Declaration of Independence and about some issues that come up in the Declaration of Independence, something about why it matters, the Declaration of Independence, and hope to leave plenty of time to interact, to talk with each other. I'm an immigrant. As Carlo said, I was born in the Dominican Republic, and I moved to the United States, to New York, when I was 12. I didn't speak English, so I sort of went to public schools, bilingual education. and learned English. I came with a green card, and my mom had come before me, and then she sponsored myself. It's a story that I'm sure is familiar to many of you. And sponsored my brother and I, who came. My brother's a little older. Eventually, I became a U.S. citizen. Took me a while, though. I was 28 before I became an American citizen. And part of why it took a long time is because I was rather conflicted about whether I wanted to be a citizen of this nation. My father in the Dominican Republic had been, still is not active anymore, but had been a radical left-wing activist, involved in politics over there, but also involved in electoral politics, but also involved in underground politics, armed movements. The Dominican Republic never took off like it did in Cuba, like to spark a revolution, but there were a number of revolutionary Marxist armed groups that were preparing to take over. And my dad sort of was part of that movement. I grew up knowing that. I grew up sometimes witnessing, being in meetings and sometimes harboring people who were on the run from the Dominican regime in our house. My dad, in the early 60s, the Dominican Republic, it had a dictator for 30 years. The dictator was murdered in 61, Trujillo. And shortly after that, there were popular elections in which a left-wing socialist president was elected, Juan Bosch. And about 7 months in, Juan Bosch suffered a coup by sort of the right-wing military and backed by big business interests and backed by the CIA, by the American government. So a civil war broke out after the coup with left-wing and a lot of popular movements backing the restoration of the elected government who had gone into exile. Juan Bosch was in Puerto Rico in exile. There was a civil war, and the U.S. invaded in 1965 to put down the uprising, and left in its place after the invasion a sort of right-wing, very repressive, not democratic regime, Joaquin Balaguer, who ruled for 12 years. Anyway, I tell you that story because I grew up under the Balaguer regime, and the first words I learned to say in English were "Yankee, go home." And the U.S. was a imperialistic, predatory, anti-democratic force in my experience of it. That was my experience of the U.S., and it is the experience of the U.S. in many places. The U.S. has been remarkably interventionist. Maybe if you put it like by historic standards, if you put it by the standards of like other similarly powerful empires, it hasn't been that interventionist. But if you just put it in the context of not being an interventionist, then the U.S. has its fingers behind a lot of regime changes and in taking down left-wing popular governments and installing in their stead right-wing, anti-communist, business-friendly governments. So when I came to the U.S., this was my relationship really to this country, and I really didn't know any of its actual history. I didn't know anything of its actual politics. I had no understanding of the inner dynamics of America. And that knowledge of sort of the inner dynamics the politics, the history of America eventually convinced me that this was actually a country that I wanted to be a citizen of, that I wanted the opportunity to participate in the political life of this crazy experiment that America is. An experiment that is built on this document called the Declaration of Independence. And because of ideas that are articulated in that document, this country becomes the kind of place that it is today, where anybody from anywhere around the world can come in and become American. I mean, if you just look around this room, the kinds of different faces that you have in a place like this, of course, New York, and this part of New York being especially a place that has welcomed immigrants. But people from all over the place like us can come to America and become American in a way that can't be done in any other country. If I'd gone to Japan or France or Great Britain, which is the country that is closest to this one culturally, I could never become British, could never become an Englishman. I would always be the Dominican if I had gone there from the Dominican Republic, or the American if I had gone from America. Even if I became a legal citizen of the EU. So I say all that, and sorry to have gone on so long in that sort of personal introduction, because my relationship to this document, the way I read this document, and the way that I think this document ought to be read today, takes it as a real thing that matters in my life, as a document that actually can be taken seriously. And that question, in fact, of whether that document can be taken seriously is a question over which this country went to war with itself, quite explicitly. In the 1850s, there was a political party, the Democratic Party, the same, genealogically linked to today's Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was a Southern-dominated party and adopted the view that the Declaration of Independence, when it said that all men are created equal, it didn't really mean all men, that it only meant white Europeans. There was another part of the country, slightly larger, represented by what became a slightly larger coalition of parties that felt differently, that thought that the Declaration of Independence meant what it said, that when the Declaration of Independence said that all men are created equal, that meant that all men are created equal, and that meant that slavery was immoral, and that meant that the United States had to get rid of slavery. And those parties coalesced around a new party, a new idea, and that party got called the Republican Party. That's how the Republican Party was born. The Republican Party was the anti-slavery party, and the Democratic Party was the pro-slavery party, which to us today might not make sense, because today the Republican Party is the party that hosts white supremacists, is most akin and has under its big umbrella the nativist and white supremacist and anti-diversity political wing of the country. And the Democratic Party has the progressive, open, racially inclusive platform. So the relationship of the parties vis-a-vis race and diversity has flipped, right? What they stand for has flipped. Well, the first president of the Republican Party elected was Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln said once that he had never had a political idea that did not stem from the Declaration of Independence. And Abraham Lincoln argued, and it's kind of amazing because you read like his debates and his speeches running for president. The speeches are a lot about the Declaration of Independence and why the Declaration of Independence means that at that point, when the country was deeply divided over the question of slavery, the country had to adopt this universal reading of the Declaration of Independence rather than that other reading that tried to say that what the text says is not what the text meant. Okay, so onto the Declaration of Independence. As you know, the United States is a British colony. The United States is a business, commerce-oriented economy, and a very powerful and growing economy. Whereas in Europe, you had the king, you had a kind of aristocracy, you had farms and a kind of feudal society. In America, you didn't have that. In America, everyone worked. People who migrated to America from the very beginning came to make a buck. There was also religious liberty and stuff, but they all had this entrepreneurial, economic engine orientation. So over time, the U.S. becomes the 13 colonies, right? And all the 13 colonies have different governments. They elect people, representatives in different ways. They have a governor that's appointed by London, right? The king appoints the governor. Each of the colonies has a royal governor. But each of the colonies also has legislatures that are locally elected that represent the Americans. Now, the local legislatures could not overrule the king. The king could veto any legislation they did. The royal governor had to approve everything. So they were independent. But there was this popular representation in each of the colonial governments. Okay, there's a war, sometimes called the French and Indian War, in which France, who's the rival colonial power to England, tries to assert control of North America. They already had Canada, the French. So there's a war in North America between essentially England and its allies, France and its allies. It's a kind of world war. It lasts 7 years. The British win. The British get to not only consolidate their possessions here, but expand them and secure them, have them recognized and undisputed. But England comes out of that war bankrupt, spent all of its money fighting that war. So the king decides to raise taxes on Americans, to raise money to protect them, to keep them in the empire. The Americans are incensed. They hate to be taxed. This is a thing that's about America. They hate to be taxed. It's something that we live with today. It's still very much part of the American identity. They hate to be taxed. So they begin to resist the taxes, and that escalates into a fight. And you probably know a turning point in that fight is the Boston Tea Party, right? We had the Tea Party movement a couple of years ago in America. There was an anti-tax movement, right-wing anti-tax movement. So the original Tea Party is these people in Boston get together, a bunch of like 100 men get together. They board some ships of the East India Company, who was like the main commercial British company, trading in tea, but a lot of other stuff. They get on these ships. They dump all the tea that's on the ship, it was like $20 million in today's dollars of cargo in tea. They dump it all on the bay. The British are outraged by this act of what today they would call terrorism. Those people would be called terrorists. That's what this government for sure would call them. So the British government instead, we will have this draconian, they invade Boston. It's like they send ICE to Boston. They were redcoats. Didn't wear masks. But also didn't use warrants. They would burst into people's houses without warrants. They would not identify themselves. They occupy Boston. They close down the port. So Boston is now economically being strangled. Nobody can do any business. Nothing's coming in, nothing's going out in Boston. Boston begins to organize all the rest of the colonies because this threat and this draconian, they suspended the legislature of Massachusetts, the king did. This draconian clampdown on Massachusetts was about Massachusetts' self-governance, self-determination, and all the colonies felt the same threat. So the colonies get together and begin to negotiate. At first with England, England does not want to negotiate. Is you take it, we have power to do this to you. The colonies begin to say, you don't have power to do that to us. Eventually, shooting breaks out. After shooting breaks out, the 13 colonies send representatives to Philadelphia to decide what's going to be done. And that is the Second Continental Congress. Jefferson was a member of the Second Continental Congress. When Jefferson arrived in May of 1775 to Philadelphia from Virginia, he comes with his personal slave named Jupiter. Jefferson was a slaveholder. Most of his wealth was in people, by owning people. Jefferson arrives 2 days before George Washington, who's also Virginian. Washington and Jefferson go back a long way. They were members of the Virginia legislature together. Washington is appointed head of the Continental Army. A Continental Army is formed just days before Jefferson arrives at Congress. And George Washington leaves 2 days after Jefferson arrives in Philadelphia to Boston to take command of the Continental Army. The debate in Congress, now that it's war, is about what are we going to do. It takes about a year of the Second Continental Congress meeting before they decide that we're going to declare independence. That the outcome of this conflict is going to be we are going to separate completely from Great Britain and be our own country. So when Jefferson arrives, his buddy, also from Virginia, a guy named Richard Henry Lee, gets up under instruction from the Virginia legislature. He gets up and he makes a proposal, a motion. He moves a motion that the Second Continental Congress do 3 things. A, declare independence. B, form a union between the 13 states, a mutual pact, a confederation, form a formal confederation, and that they begin to negotiate treaties with foreign nations as an independent nation for help in the war. The representatives from the 13 colonies, it's clear that there is majority support for those resolutions, for independence, for confederation, for treaties with foreign nations. But there isn't unanimity. In fact, some of the representatives in Congress, in the Second Continental Congress, have been explicitly forbidden by their legislatures, the groups back home in their states that sent them, that chose them, have been forbidden from voting for independence. So what they do is they say, let's wait 3 weeks before we take a vote on those resolutions. And during those 3 weeks, we'll try to get permission or to clarify, to move public opinion so that we can have this vote be unanimous. When they take that 3-week break, they appoint a committee to write a Declaration of Independence so that when they reconvene, they can vote on it. The committee includes Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, Benjamin Franklin, who by that time is like 80 years old. He's like a sage. He's a revered, respected, most famous American, probably the most respected American at the time. It includes Roger Sherman from Connecticut, John Adams from Massachusetts, and somebody from New York. Forget who right now. They formed this committee to write the Declaration of Independence. Franklin might have been like the obvious person to write because Franklin was a writer and editor, but Franklin turns down the job, and the job lands on Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson drafts the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is then reviewed by the committee. They make a couple of little changes. The Declaration of Independence is submitted to the Congress. The Congress, Continental Congress, goes through it line by line and changes a number of things, leaves it like 80% the same, but changes a couple of significant things, votes on it on July 4th, 1776. unanimous vote on the Declaration of Independence. So what does the Declaration of Independence say? You probably all heard these phrases. It starts when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands that have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate but equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them. A decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they state the reasons that impel them to the separation. That's the first sentence. Then comes the part that most people know. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted on earth, drawing their just powers from consent of the governed. That when any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to erect new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. That's the second famous sentence of the Declaration. Then the Declaration moves on to offer a series of charges against the king. Because, see, the Declaration has now laid out that when in the course of human events it's necessary for a people to separate from another, they should state the causes that impel them to the separation. So these are the causes. The causes is that the King of England is becoming a tyrant and wants to exercise complete, irresponsible, absolute power over the colonists. And then they list Jefferson lists 18 instances that demonstrate that the king is trying to do this. It's really funny because if you look at those things, you know, we are in a political moment where the President of the United States is trying to assert a degree of power and unaccountability that is unparalleled in the history of the American president. There has been no American president. American presidents have done a lot of bad shit. There has not been an American president that has tried to assume the dictatorial, unaccountable, unconstitutional powers that this president has been trying to incorporate. And the Declaration, like, look at some of these charges. Things that the King of England has done or is doing. And it's striking how they read different today than they did just a few years ago because of what we're facing politically. So here's the seventh charge. He, the King of England, that is George III, has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. Okay, one part of the problem is that the king is obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, preventing foreigners from becoming American, and refusing to pass laws to encourage their immigration here. Here's another thing. He has quartered large bodies of armed troops among us and protects them by mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Again, I think that sounds kind of eerie now because it reminds one of the stuff that ICE is doing and of the executive protection against investigation of those of the murders that have been committed. 2 murders have been committed. So one of the things that makes the Declaration of Independence valuable today is that it gives a description of what a tyrannical government looks like. It gives a description of the basis upon which a government of a free people can act. The government of an unfree people, a king, a monarch, can do things. Well, a monarch has absolute powers. But if you're going to create a government where the people remain free, not subjugated, if you're going to create a government by consent, that government is going to have limited powers. There are going to be certain things that that government cannot do. That government cannot tax the people, raise taxes without consent. That's why only the legislature, right? Only Congress can raise taxes. President can't raise taxes. Although, one of the accusations they make there is that the king is establishing conditions that prevent commerce, that prevent business, that prevents. Actually, let me see if I find the exact wording, because it's again one of those places that makes it sound like tariffs. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent thither swarms of new officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing militias without consent of our legislatures. I can't put my finger right now on the charge where he charges the king with preventing international trade. So anyway, the Declaration lays out a picture of what government of a free people looks like, of what kinds of limits and what kinds of constraints a government has to operate on. So, back to that famous sentence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable means that they can't be taken away from you. You can't be alienated. They can't be estranged. They can't be separated from you. These rights. Among them, he says, our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what could that mean? Your life can be taken away. Your liberty can be taken away. We put people in jail all the time. Your right to pursuit of happiness, it's more questionable. But like if you're in jail, for example, I think your pursuit of happiness is significantly impaired. So your life can be taken away, your liberty can be taken away, but your right to life cannot be taken away. Your right to liberty cannot be taken away. These rights are inalienable. And where do the rights come from? They have been endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, this is a kind of religious idea that these rights precede government. These rights are not created by government. They're not granted by government. They're not instituted by government. They're not created by governments. These rights are part of our natural human endowment just by virtue of being humans. Now, he puts it there, they're endowed by their Creator. Now, if you're religious, you can think of that as God. If you're not religious, you can think of that as nature, right? Natural selection created us. Nature created us. We are the product of nature. But by virtue of the way that we are, by virtue of being human, of existing, we have certain rights that have nothing to do with government, that are pre-existent to government. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Then he adds that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Right? The point of government, why government is created, is to secure those rights. Remember, not create them, not grant them, secure them, because they're already there. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, he says, among men. Governments are instituted among men. Governments are not divine creations. Governments are not supernatural impositions. Governments are not, there's no divine right of kings. There is nobody that gets a right from divinity to rule. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. They derive their just powers. That means that there are governmental powers that are just. There are governmental powers that are unjust. And only governmental power that is derived from the consent of the people is just. Deriving the just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this idea that the governed have the standing to give consent to how they are to be governed, that is a crazy and radical idea. Nobody in the history of humanity had ever organized a government on the assumption that everybody who's going to be governed by it is competent to give consent, to agree, to decide how governing is going to happen. Even in ancient governments that we call democracies, like Athens, the most famous one. Athens is a democracy. But Athens has a huge slave population, multiples of the size of the number of citizens. Among the citizens, only the males, not the females, who participate in democracy. So when you get down to right down to it, what you have in Athens is a large majority being governed by a small minority which governs itself democratically. That small minority of the governed governs itself and the rest democratically. But the rest, ordinary people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is crazy. This is the first country that attempts to organize itself on that basis. Now, of course, we know that in this country, that basis is severely curtailed, like it was in Athens. Slavery, gender, sex restrictions. We still hold children restrictions. Children don't vote. We still hold that. And we don't allow their parents to vote for them. I have 2 kids. My vote, I can't vote, make their vote count. So we still have some restrictions. But the basis of the country, and this is what Lincoln was arguing at the time of the Civil War, the basis of the country is that all men are competent and entitled to give their consent to anything that governs them. And of course, because of that, the United States has moved in that direction. We're not there yet, but we're a lot closer than we were even 50 years ago. And it's not a linear path. Take some steps forward and some steps backward, and we are in a backward stepping moment right now. But if this country survives, if this country makes it out of this, we're going to start making steps forward again, because that's what the country fundamentally has committed itself to on these founding documents. Government by consent of the government. Ordinary people have the capacity and the entitlement to weigh in on matters of governance. I just want to emphasize that because we're in a democratic country, a country with democratic ideals, that seems so obvious to us. But for a long time, Every time that anything like that was tried, it would end in disaster. People did not seem for a long time to be competent enough to give consent about how they were to be governed. They had to be governed by wise people, people of understanding, who led the people rather than follow the people. They led the people. I have a friend who likes to say that the problem with democracy is that the people rule. And you can see that there can be problems with majority rule. When, the white supremacist regime of Jim Crow was kept in place by majority consent. The white majority, agreed to discriminate and exploit and disempower the black people. Majority rule. So majority rule is not, democracy, majority rule is not in itself a guarantor of just results. There can be an unjust, there can be an ignorant majority. There can be a majority who is superstitious. There can be a majority who believes a conspiracy. Right now, the big conspiracies are believed only by minorities. But believe me, there can be and there have been conspiracies that are believed by the majority. And then what do you do then? So democracy was always thought maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to maintain constraints. And again, the way that the government is organized initially, as you can see in the Constitution, does introduce lots of constraints. But this idea that this is what the country believes, and this is what the country is going to set up as a standard for just government, that's radical. That is of historic world significance. That document and that statement in the Declaration of Independence is the statement around which modern politics have been built. Modernity, politically speaking, is being built around the view of government that's articulated in the Declaration of Independence. It's why so many nations, so many countries have been born invoking the Declaration of Independence. And so many movements for rights, like the Seneca Declaration of Sentiments, that launched the feminist suffragist movement, the movement to win women the vote. That declaration is modeled on the Declaration of Independence. The French Declaration of the Rights of Women, it's framed also, in that case, after the French Declaration of Universal Rights, in which Jefferson had a hand in writing. So these political commitments have been the grounding commitments of our political life. And today, I just want to end my part of the remarks at so many other things I wanted to point out in the declaration, but maybe they'll come up in discussion. But I guess I want to close my part before I do questions by restating the fact that the Declaration of Independence has relevance today on its 250th anniversary year in a way that it hasn't in my lifetime. I mean, it was always an important and interesting document, and one that I was reading and writing about and teaching way before this moment. But there is something about this moment that has said, are we going to be the country that this document declares? Are we going to be the country that is envisioned and signed on and launched in 1776 and reasserted in 1863 with the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? Are we going to be that country? Are we going to be the country of the 14th Amendment? The 14th Amendment is the amendment that establishes birthright citizenship. It's the amendment that says that my children are American. They were born here. They're American. That can't be denied to them regardless of what my status is. That's the 14th Amendment, Civil War Amendment. Are we going to be that country? The administration is challenging that right now, right? That thing, which is a constitutional amendment that says very literally that every person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. It's being challenged. And lots of other things. We are at this moment in the history of the country where we are deciding, not for the first time, we've had to make this decision before. We had to do it in the Civil War. We had to do it in the Civil Rights Movement. We had to do it in the suffragist movement. And we are at one of those points again where we have to decide, are we going to be that country or are we going to be something else? Are we going to be the country that insists that all men are created equal and that takes the Declaration of Independence to mean what it says and to take this government of free people to be the thing that we are going to stand for, a government of free people, a government by consent of the governed? Or are we going to become this other thing that many nations have become, that many nations have been? This is a moment of national definition. And this document, this declaration, is the most authentic grounding upon which those of us who believe in that vision can fight to make this country more like the country that's described there than like the country that the people in power now want to make it. Okay.
Well, thank you. Oh, we have two now, so perfect. And well, now it's up to you. So I'm going to open it for questions from the audience, and I'll group a few if that's okay for you. And then we have time. We have about half an hour. Let's start with Ryan there, and then I'll go to Ishika. I'll come. Everybody's going to get a chance. We have time. Please keep your questions to under a minute.
I do not promise to keep my answers under a minute.
Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm a poli-sci major. I'm a senior Moynihan fellow. My question is, if the Declaration of Independence is both a philosophical document and a political tool, how should we understand the gap between its ideals and the reality that many people weren't included in those ideals at the time? And does that gap weaken its authority today, or does it make it more powerful?
Great question. Ishika, is it okay for you if I group a few? Or you prefer one by one?
Yeah, well, it depends how different they are. So let me address this.
Sure.
Address this one, because it's a very substantive question. Yes, the Declaration of Independence is a philosophical document and a political document. But as a philosophical and a political document, it states a vision and a set of abstract truths. It is not a governing document. That is the Constitution. So 13 years after the Declaration of Independence, they get together to actually organize a government. And that Constitution of 1789, which organizes the country really politically, falls so far short of the Declaration of Independence's ideals. It still maintains some important ones, but makes compromises on this question of slavery in particular. Those are the most egregious violations of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Now, as I said, a war is fought over that. Lincoln in 1857, in 1857, the Supreme Court rules in the Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case in 1857 is an enslaved person named Scott, whose owner takes him to live in a free territory where the law says that that any person who lives in that territory for a certain number of years is free. Slavery is not allowed. in that place. That amount of time passes. Dred Scott sues for his freedom and his wife and children's freedom. It makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules in 1857 that Dred Scott, because he is black, does not have standing before the court, that he is not entitled to any of the legal protections. He is not, legally speaking, a person. He cannot sue for his own liberty. He is not recognized. And that opinion, it's a chilling opinion written by Chief Justice Roger Taney. And Roger Taney said, the Declaration of Independence, when it says that all men are created equal, it does not include black people. He says it directly. Black people have no rights that white man is bound to respect. Says that literally. No black person can ever become a citizen of the United States, says the opinion. Lincoln, in some ways, Lincoln runs for president against the Supreme Court and that position. And one of the arguments Lincoln makes is, look, when the Declaration of Independence was adopted, and I think this is what most directly answers your question, Lincoln says, when the Declaration of Independence was adopted, they did not mean to say that every person was the same in every respect. What they meant to do was set up a standard towards which we continually move and continually advance. Like at that moment, circumstances did not permit us to go very far in that direction. But the commitment was that we would work to create the conditions that move us in that direction. And I think that's still the case today. I really cannot imagine ever achieving the kind of perfection that this document envisions. So what this document sets is a direction, is a goal, is a goal towards which we as a nation evolve. So this document, so in a way, maybe we don't even need to reconcile that with the reality. Reality is never going to, I think, attain a perfect instantiation of a just government. But what we commit ourselves is to constantly be working to get there.
Ishika? And then you let me know if you wanted to group them or not, depending on the question.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Ishika. I'm a second-year public service fellow at the Moynihan Center. I find the parallels that you draw between the British monarch and our current administration very compelling, especially as an immigrant. The part that you where you highlighted the parallels between ICE and redcoats stood out to me a lot. My question is, do you believe that we can invoke the same narrative about the Declaration of Independence at the legislative level to fight back against Trump 2 policies? If so, what might that look like, especially with the context of the extreme polarization in our government, where there is great disagreement even about what fundamental rights are inalienable to our citizens?
I think I'll answer it quick.
But can I add something to it?
Yeah, please.
It seems to me an interesting fact, just putting a point on that the very people that you claim today are undermining the values of the Declaration very much appeal to it too. So when some people wrote the 1619 Project, the right, the Trumpist world produced a 1776 project, so the very ones whom you claim are the Georges of the world are actually appealing to this very document today. Absolutely. How do we make sense of that?
I think that gets at such a critical point of our politics right now. The left has made this huge mistake in rejecting American patriotism, in ceding to the right respect and veneration for the founding, for the Declaration and for the Constitution. The left ought to wrap itself in the flag. Every anti-MAGA protest should be swimming with American flags. And part of this has been because of a critique of a rosy narrative that used to be dominant, that denied slavery, that denied abuses, that claimed America to be perfect. And of course, intellectuals and historians say that's crap. This country is full of problems. This country has betrayed its ideals so many times. This country continues to violate some of those ideals. But in doing that, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. But we have to keep the baby and throw out the bathwater. But the baby is worth keeping. So I think it's really critical and crucial that the left fight its anti-MAGA fight on American principles. And they're there. I mean, read the damn thing. They're there, the American principles on the basis of which we can push back against the authoritarian threat that we are facing in American politics right now.
Pragyam?
Hi, you mentioned the sort of religious aspect of the rights.
Wait a second.
Hi, thanks. You mentioned the sort of religious aspects of the Declaration of Independence. Gradually, religious values and thoughts change. We're seeing a decline in religiosity. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that regarding the Declaration of Independence and the values that we gain from it. And then also, I was curious about well, I forget what I was curious about. I might think of it again. I'm sorry.
That's a great question about religion. There is a decline in religious practice and belief in the whole West, in Europe, and less so in the United States, but even in the United States. And there are people who think that you can't embrace these ideals fully unless you are some kind of religious devotee. That is, that if you don't have a religious anchor, if you don't believe that the Creator gave us inalienable rights, you can't really embrace these ideas and fight for them truly. I don't think so. I do think that there is a reverence and a embrace of these values that approaches religious conviction, but is not religious. It's humanist. That is, you can believe in these values without assigning them to a divinity. Lincoln again called that a civic religion. America has such a thing as a civic religion. We hold these truths to be self-evident. But what makes a people in the Declaration of Independence is our commitment to these abstract truths. Lincoln again, the Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, that's 87 years ago. He's speaking in 1863, 7 years ago, 87 years ago before 63, 1776. In 1776, 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent, a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. A nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created. That's what makes the nation a nation. That's what makes this nation a nation. It is a shared dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. You know, nations usually are nations because of their shared ancestry, their shared culture, their shared ethnicity, their shared religion, their shared language. Not America. We do not have a shared religion. We do not have a shared ancestry. We do not have a shared culture. What we share is a dedication to the proposition that all men are created equal. I think you can't be dedicated to that proposition in a way that approaches religious devotion without needing the religious apparatus. Now, religion can be really, really good for people, for society. I'm not an anti-religion person, but I don't think it's a requirement for the kind of democracy that's outlined in the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nicole?
My question is about the new rise of intellectualism in America right now and how that has been fueling a lot of bigotry. How do you think...
The new rise of intellectualism?
Yeah.
Like the right-wing intellectuals, you mean?
Yeah, like mainly using emotion as evidence instead of like for example the U.S. Like documents. They're not using that as evidence. They're mainly
Yeah.
using their, I guess, hatred towards immigration and things like that. How do you think we can still all come together as citizens, no matter our beliefs, to actually fight for our fundamental inalienable rights?
Yeah. The one segment of the American population is invoking a lot of prejudice against immigrants, against people of color, against elites, against the media, against the academy, against intellectuals, a lot of prejudice. It's always been a part of the American political fight. In the 1850s, and sorry, keep talking about Lincoln, but it's because at that period is when the nation, there are two revolutions in America, the Independence War and the Civil War. American Revolution comes in two phases. The first one gives us the Constitution of 1789 with slavery in it. The second one gives us the Constitution of 1863, 4, 5, the post-Civil War Constitution without slavery in it, with voting, with universal voting, with an asterisk because women were not yet included, with birthright citizenship, with the various protections of the 14th Amendment. So sorry to come back to that, but back then in the 1850s, the Democrats were always invoking racial prejudice. We're always saying, oh, if you elect these Republicans, you're going to have black people marrying white people. You're going to have black people in juries deciding on your liberties. You are going to have white men going after your daughters. Black men going after your white daughters. This is what they would say. They will always be wrangling this prejudice, exploiting the prejudice and trying to then attach that prejudice to their political opponents. That's the way American politics is done. Over and over again, you see it, and we're seeing it now. So, I think that we have to fight it the same way that it's been fought before, by sharpening a message that is true and a message that is anchored on enduring values, because these values have very wide appeal. These values are persistently compelling. They touch people very deeply. And I think we have to, in pushing back against the weaponization of prejudice, we have to do this. We have to articulate clearly these values and articulate why those values are worth having in a decent society.
Would you mind if I group a few, because you see lots of people.
Get to more.
Right. So how about you just go to Samantha, then I'll group this little part, and then I'll move to that part.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. My name is Samantha. I'm a senior Moynihan Fellow. I was curious when reading the Declaration of Independence about the part that talks about when is the right time for people to make change. And it says that change shouldn't be made for light or transient causes. And it also speaks about people kind of being accustomed to the evils that they face daily, and they kind of fall into a routine with that. And then it claims that the long trail of abuses is what eventually gives right and makes it the duty for the people to throw off such government. Yeah. So I'm curious, in today's world, what that duty looks like for us, and when we know is the right time to be taking action.
Great question. Thank you. Why don't you pass it on to, yes, and then...
Hello, I'm Lisbeth. I'm an alumnus of the Moynihan Center. You mentioned in your lecture that included in the Declaration of Independence is an emphasis on economic freedom and participation, and thus the implication that a big part of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the freedom to pursue economic interests. Do you think there are inherent constraints in defining freedom along these lines? Great questions.
Hi, this is Tanima. I'm a junior and a first-year Moynihan Fellow. First of all, the connections you made to today's government, comparing it with the British monarch, right? I think that makes a lot of sense. But my question is kind of slightly different. So if consent of the governed is the founding principle, right? Doesn't the fact that most people were excluded at the founding kind of like undermine the legitimacy of the entire project. Like, why should we treat the Declaration as a authoritative like thing when it was written by a slaveholding elite?
Good one.
Thank you.
It seems there's quite a lot on the table at this point. Next round, I'm coming to this side.
Okay. I think to get through three questions in this turn, I think I'm going to have to like compress and simplify the question so that I can give it a simpler, quicker answer. But I think the question that you raise is, when is it legitimate to revolutionize, right? When do the train of abuses by the government reach the threshold that you can say, as Jefferson says in the Declaration, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. At what point can we make a list, like Jefferson made a list of what turned out to be 26 charges? 26 charges on the basis of which they were taking up arms to overthrow the existing government. So obviously there is no formula for that. At what point are conditions so bad that they justify violent revolution? I think the first there is no formula for that answer, but one of the criteria is that you have to have a very large, if not a majority, a very, very large, very close to a majority of people who have reached that point. Then there is there's a question of violence. Is violence ever justified? And I think in a democratic polity, there are so many ways of resisting and so many ways of applying moral pressure within the compact. When we go into civil war, that means the democracy is dead. Democracies die when there's a civil war, when the conflicts can no longer be resolved within the constitutional framework. If we take up arms, it means the democracy is dead. We're not going to take power by force and then set up a government that will say it's going to be democratic, but in every single instance, when the armed movement takes over, they don't create the happy democracy. So that's one thing to say. We can read Martin Luther King, we can read Gandhi, there are so many successful political movements and channels, and I think we're nowhere close to giving those up. Economic freedom the Declaration involves economic freedom. Freedom to pursue happiness involves economic freedom, right? It involves your ability to make money, your ability to engage in enterprises that are profit-seeking and profit-making as long as they're legal. That's essentially capitalism. But the question is, can we restrict those liberties? And I think that we can, just in the way that we can restrict personal liberties, right? You are not free to do false advertisement. You're not free to take other people's property. You're not free to engage in even certain forms of speech. There are all kinds of things that are in which we curtail your natural freedom in the interest of our communal life. Same things happens economically. I think we as a community have the right to introduce constraints on economic activity. There is a burden that you have to meet. It has to be clearly for the benefit of the community and of the whole. But there are forms of economic behavior that are destructive to the community. And those can be legitimately, I think, curtailed, even in a liberal democracy. Though slavery and how far these guys who framed this are enacting this, from enacting those ideas, undermine, delegitimize them, make them irrelevant. I think not. I think we have to see what those documents say. Humans behave self-interestedly at the individual level and at the collective level. And we will never get to a point where our adoption of these principles, that is, Yeah, we will never get to a point where our adoption of these principles is justified by the perfect subordination of self-interest and the pursuit of justice and righteousness in a system. If we are going to wait for a system that perfectly embodies these principles before we can adopt the principles, we will never adopt them. We have to adopt the principles first, and on that basis reform the society. So the fact that these people were so deeply tainted and so far from fulfilling the ideals that they articulated does not negate the ideas. There were some among them who did not subscribe to these ideas. There's a famous quote, sorry, I'm going on and on, and I know we want to get to more questions. There's a famous quote that John Quincy Adams in 1827 writes in a letter. He says, "Did Mr. Jefferson realize when writing the Declaration that he was opening a gulf, he was opening a gash, he was opening a chasm, a hole into which the slaveholding South would fall?" Right? Did Jefferson realize that in writing those words, he was making a grave into which Southern slavery is going to fall? I think Jefferson did realize that. And he didn't have the personal courage or the personal wherewithal to free his own slaves, although he did propose the abolition of slavery various times in the Virginia legislature and in the Declaration of Independence, a thing I didn't get to. But Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration had a condemnation of slavery in it. So he makes gestures to it, but nobody takes it up, and he doesn't individually do it. But the fact that they have these personal failings and these personal limitations, I think has to be kept apart from the merit of their ideas and the choice-worthiness of the principles that they lay out.
So I know many others have questions. I'm really sorry, but we're out of time at this point. So please join me in thanking Roosevelt for this wonderful lecture. And we'll continue the conversations about the Declaration in these events that I mentioned. And this was a great start. Thank you all for coming. And thank you again, Roosevelt.
Thank you.